Hi, I'm Greg Brahe, and I'm an atheist. Intellectual honesty can be a scary thing. It means setting aside your pride, putting your most cherished beliefs on the line, and examining them with honest and open inquiry, looking at them from dissenting viewpoints and considering all of the evidence and all the options and admitting a possibility that you might be wrong. That's so scary, in fact, that people have cloistered themselves away. They've locked out dissenting opinions, shunned them, or worse, through almost all of human history. But the New Covenant Group is different. Join us Sundays at 6 o'clock for Inspiring Honesty, authentic inquiry between a believer and a non-believer on the questions that really matter.
I like the way that Greg is engaged. He's enthusiastic about this in a very real way, which is excellent. I think he's ready to deal with the issues, bring out what he perceives, and to be honest with you, I'm more than excited and ready to respond.
When I was first asked to be on the show, I have to be honest, it was a little daunting. I've never seen, and as far as I'm aware, there's never been an atheist in a hosting position on a regular show through a Christian broadcast. That's a lot of pressure. I need to really represent my side well, but I'm excited. I think that this is going to be a fantastic opportunity for some important conversations that never would have happened if the Christians stayed with the Christians and the atheists stayed with the atheists and the theists stayed with the theists and the Muslims stayed with the Muslims. The conversations need to be addressed from multiple angles.
Whatever there is to risk through genuine dialogue, it probably isn't worth having.
In polite society, there have always been things that are considered taboo. A person's faith is beyond question. It's beyond challenge. It's sacred. Well, I disagree. And the New Covenant Group has invited me to be part of their show where, for the first time ever, an atheist, myself, can sit down with a believer and have real conversations about the subjects that matter, subjects that have always been off limits before. Hi, this is Greg Brahe with Inspiring Honesty. I wanted to welcome you to the show and let you know that today I am broadcasting live from a new location. I am coming from my brother's house. He is in the Army, getting out this Wednesday, so I'm here to help him move back to Wisconsin and rejoin our regular lives in the family. Really excited about that. Also excited to be in Texas for this week, and it's for a very specific point. As I've mentioned before, I am an atheist. That's part of the reasoning behind this show. And as an atheist, there's an interesting situation that we end up in frequently. We are not a very liked group in the United States. There have been plenty of movements and justifications, even studies recently that ask about how accepted atheists are. And it's been shown that we are, in some of these studies, as mistrusted as any other group of people, including rapists and murderers. So one of the reasons I'm excited to be in Texas today is because this is one of the 7 states in the United States where I cannot legally hold office according to either laws on the books or the state constitution itself. To read to you right away, this is the exact wording for Texas. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust in this state, nor shall anyone be excluded from holding office on account of his religious sentiments, provided he acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. So, I'm Greg Brahe, I'm an atheist, and I cannot be a politician in Texas. Tonight, you're in for a continuation of last week's show. It's hopefully going to get more in depth and hit the harder hitting questions. I'll be joined again by our very own unconventional pastor, Bob Greaves, and I did want to introduce him, but before I get to that, I want to start with a quick disclaimer. First of all, this show is entirely unscripted. I may say things during the show, or we may come up on topics that you find insulting as the viewers. I'll tell you that we don't mean anything by it. It's sometimes impossible to question the most fundamental beliefs of any person without coming up into situations where it makes them uncomfortable, even feeling insulted. But we're not trying to attack you. Our goal is honesty. And to achieve that, nothing can be taboo. Wanted to give you a quick intro before one last moment before we bring Bob in, is that I had a question come to me last week as to why I do this. Came to my Facebook account after the show from a friend of mine who is, basically another mother to me. I love her very, very dearly. And she has been part of this movement that myself and my friend have been doing. We started our own Facebook page, which is what got me involved with Dr. Jones and the New Covenant group in the first place. That Facebook page, by the way, is Inspiring Doubt. Feel free to check us out. It does get more into politics, a little different from the goal of this show. But there was a question as to why I think this is important, why it's valuable, and I wanted to get into that. The first thing is that these questions are important. Whether I'm correct and this life is the only life that we have, or Bob is correct and there will be an afterlife, but we're going to come up with an opportunity for universal reconciliation in some form of purgatory, whether there is a hell where I could potentially suffer eternal torture, or any of the other myriad beliefs that there have been. These are important questions, things that if one of them does turn out to be true, it's going to have an effect on all of us. Also, they overlap. It is impossible for all of them to be true. It's impossible for any two to be true. It's important that we recognize that truth has a value, and that's why I do this. If we cannot seek the truth, if we can't talk about things of this nature without getting into concerns that it's taboo and it's making people feel uncomfortable, there's no way that we can possibly work together to find the truth, to be honest with one another, and to recognize that there are questions, but questions do have answers, and simply avoiding them is not the way to do it. So, welcome again to Inspiring Honesty, and please join us for the remainder of the show as I introduce Bob Greaves again, our unconventional pastor. Bob, welcome to the show.
How you doing?
I'm sorry?
I'm just saying hi, how are you doing? And your voice cut out just as I said that, so hopefully it won't cut out more.
I am fantastic. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good.
All right. Well, I'm glad to have you. Thank you for joining us again. It's really exciting. I've been chewing on this all week. Really excited to continue the conversation that we had last week and get more into some of the deeper parts of what we had. Now that we don't need to spend time talking. I'm sorry, I've been pronouncing your name wrong. Joey it's Bob Greaves.
Yeah, that E is a silent thing. It's just not.
I apologize. Thank you to our producer who sent me that message. I have never been correct on that before. So, well, then we have Bob Greaves with us on the show here.
Yeah.
I apologize. Okay. I'm flustered now. That threw me off.
I get that all the time, though. So I'm so used to it. I don't even always notice it. So.
Okay. Very sorry about that. I'm excited that we know a little bit more about your theology, and we can discuss some of the more general questions about theology itself this week. Are you ready to join me in that?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
All right. Fantastic. I wanted to recap a little bit. I took some notes on our conversation last week, and just wanted to make sure that we're still representing your position accurately. One, we talked about whether you were a deist or a Christian. You said that you certainly believe that I think the way that you put it is that Christianity has potential for uniqueness. It's coherent, but not so compelling that you can require other people to believe it. Does that seem accurate?
Well, perhaps. I would not align myself with everything that might be called Christianity. And in fact, if we can get the ism out of it, if Jesus as an historical person went through this death, burial, and resurrection, and we trust in that as an event, not as a concept, there's a sense in which that is how I understand my Christian faith. So this concept of the thing called Christianity itself is something I'm very uncomfortable with personally. In fact, I rarely call myself a Christian except when it's, you can't explain this all the time. Most of the time I just consider myself a person of faith in Christ.
And, I would argue at least that that's what the true definition of Christian really should mean. But unfortunately, as we discussed last week, it's very difficult to have any religious terminology that hasn't been used in 1,000 different ways. So that's why I find it so important to talk about what people actually do believe and bring that up at the beginning. So thank you once again for clarifying that. And please, if at any point you feel that I'm misrepresenting what you've said or what you mean, by all means, let us know, share that with the group, because I do not want to do that. This is all about intellectual honesty and making sure that, that's possible and that's only possible if we work together on making sure that we're all on the same page. So there were a few issues that we hit towards the end of the show that I wanted to get into here. I apologize. I'm changing a setting here on the computer. So, okay. One of them, you had mentioned that you do not believe the idea of Christ and Yahweh to be 100% reconcilable. And that led into some conversations towards the end of the show that was really, that's my niece that you might hear crying in the background. I just met her for the first time yesterday. She's 11 months old. Love her to death. She's adorable.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that would be an accurate generalization. I find the cult of Yahweh and the immersion of Christ in history as representing, something that comes to a head that does not quite fit neatly together. Definitely.
Okay. And there was, we had viewers write in last week, and please, again, viewers, we love your interaction. If you have a question for us, we would love to tackle it. Comment, anything. Unfortunately, Bob and I think Bob might be able to, but I can't watch the Ustream feed at the same time without hurting my connection speeds. So if you're putting comments on that, please. You are too? Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
Then please note on there or send it. I believe that there's a text message that you can send them to directly as well, and hopefully Joey can pop that up on the screen for you. But we would love to have your interaction, and he will forward the questions on to me, and we'll get to them whenever there's a coherent moment in the show to break to that. I unfortunately can't get to all of them, but I'd love to have that interaction. So please join us with that. But the question that came up last week, or the comment, was about Christ being the true God and Yahweh being an imposter God, which does fold into the idea that the cult of Yahweh and that which is Christ cannot be molded together coherently. And what I wanted to get to with that is another comment that you made, or that I think I had questioned you, and basically.
By the way,
I'm
let me ask you: is that a problem?
Sure.
Is that a problem? Is there a need to put them together?
Well, and that's where I'm looking for the actual quote here. Is that I had said, how do you justify it?
Well, one of the reasons that you can justify it is this. How long have you been married, Greg?
Ooh, putting me on the spot. No, we celebrated our 5-year anniversary this year.
Well, congratulations. I would have to say this, that chances are that the person you are and the person your wife is, uh, that both of you are in some ways people you're discovering you already are, as well as your people who are changing. And when your relationship begins, you have impressions of each other. And over time, those impressions, you both go through change as people, but you also go through processes of discovery. And so I see the human race in an entire process of discovery and filled with a great number of intermittent conclusions that don't necessarily have to maintain constant coherence with the past. So I don't see it as a problem.
So the idea of a continual revelation is sort of where you're coming to, is that it develops with time, the concept of God?
As a human being, it's just not possible for you to meet a person that you're going to end up marrying and that you really know everything about them. You don't. You can't. And nor is it necessary. And I think that if humankind is going to have a relationship with God, there's just no way that we can make this happen suddenly all at once without violating our own continuum of personality. So it's a process.
Sure. And, I completely understand that. I think that I've heard some fantastic arguments about the development of theology over time sort of being a building process. The idea of, the tribal animistic or ancestral gods leading into polytheism that explained all of the functions of the universe to a monotheism. I personally believe that the next step in that is an atheism. But that's my own journey, and I'll get to that at some point later in the show. And I really hope to do that justice in a way that brings it all together. But the question that I really wanted to get at with this, aside from the justification of Yahweh and Jesus not coming together, it's what came at the end of the show. I think we had a minute left when we started to touch on it, and that was the idea that you said you can't conceive of a God where that which is unverifiable has any bearing. So the topic that I wanted to get into today is, what is verifiable? How do we know anything about this God, or anything, the nature of this God? How is it possible for us to say, I feel that this is true, or I know that this is true, or I'm confident that this is true, when something else could be just as true, and somebody else can be just as confident of that truth? And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there's no way that we can all be correct. How can we know what is out there?
You can't. Plain and simple.
Okay.
Can't.
How can we be confident about what is out there?
How confident? Well, I think that since science, every time it proves anything, proves that here again is something else that has always been true, but up until now we didn't know it for sure. I think that, inductively we can assume there must be a lot more out there that is also true that we have yet to verify. Secondly, we live in a world where, unfortunately, in terms of science, you're limited to what can be sensory perceived, either by us or by instruments we create. And there cannot be this assumption that since we have developed instruments that can now measure things we couldn't measure in the past, that there won't be ways of measuring things that we don't know about yet in the future. So I think that there is great scientific evidence for the fact that there is a whole bunch of things that are true, and we just don't know them with certainty. And I think we can be certain about that and confident.
I completely agree. And as the show, I've seen the promo spots. It has they mentioned that I am a biologist by education. That is my background, and specifically that plays a large role in my atheism as well. The idea, and it's a large degree of it does have to do with the theory of evolution, but that's not it entirely. It has to do with the scientific process, the way of reasoning that is science, and that's. I completely agree with your assumption that there is that there is more out there that we don't know, and that we may not be able to know it now, but there's no reason to assume that we won't know it. I think the moment we stop trying to know things is the moment that we fail as humans to grow.
And there's a sense in which we're both scientists. I do teach audio engineering, and as such, the science of sound. We measure sound. We determine exactly what it is, how these variations of atmospheric pressure work. We seek to measure them. We seek to verify. We seek to experiment with these things and understand them. And I would even say that my own respect for the scientific method has played a significant role in why I am unconventional as a pastor.
I would hope so. I think it's difficult to be intellectually honest and to be conventional as a pastor and as a scientist. They're hard to reconcile completely by the traditional ideas of faith.
Painted into a corner.
That's pretty accurate in my opinion, at least. I try not to make dogmatic statements, but knowing what I know about science and knowing what I know about traditional religion, it can be very, very difficult to reconcile the two. But even so, the idea that there is a more knowledge out there and things that may be true that we don't know yet is a perfectly valid scientific hypothesis, and it's verified constantly.
But we can even make it personal. For example, I believe that my wife loves me. I believe she respects me. I believe that I love her. But I got to be honest with you. Love is a very difficult thing to precisely define. It tends to be more of an experience we try to define and sometimes even catch ourselves misdefining it. Or working with a model of it that isn't really as loving as we might later discover, and yet on what basis? And how can I ever prove that I really do love her? How can she prove that she really does love me? And yet we can also scientifically prove that a child that grows up believing that it is not loved will suffer a great number of developmental problems. So here we're struggling with a very real experience of the human being that we still can't prove, and yet it's extremely central to our well-being and health.
I completely recognize that. That's a fantastic point. Actually, I used the exact same reference when the first time I was ever on. This was a show on the New Covenant group, but when I was brought on as a guest, I used that exact same reference, talking about proving that my wife loves me, or that I love my wife, and that it's unprovable. It's something that you sort of do have to take on faith. But go ahead.
And if we're going to be honest, I think that sometimes our love grows where it is lacking because we are trusted to have it and we rise to the occasion. So there's a sense in which trust is earned, but sometimes it's also encouraged.
That's true, but love does have evidence. It's something that I may believe that my wife loves me.
There's reasonable cause for this to settle on it. Yes,
certainly. I mean, it's not a completely unsupportable hypothesis. The love hypothesis is one that there's plenty of ways that you can at least have tentative verification of. And I mean, there's plenty of situations where there are people who they believe they are in love, or they even believe that they are loved back, and the second party may not even be aware of it. We call them stalkers.
Our culture, unfortunately, has confused the idea of love with affection. Now, I certainly think that wherever there is real love, there will be a bounty of affection. But affection in and of itself is, in a sense, a self-absorbed experience. When I enjoy spending time with my wife. We went down to New York City just yesterday. Had a good time spending it with her. But you know what? her value as a human being and the love that I have for her is something that I think of as other than my particular enjoyment of spending time with her. They're connected, but whenever my enjoyment of spending time with her becomes more important than who she is as a person, there's something violating going on there. And so, but I'll tell you, it took me a number of years myself growing up to even recognize the difference between love and affection, And,
That's a fantastic point, and it works both ways. The same comes as, or the same is true when you discuss how your affection to your affection to your wife, and that becomes the focus over your love for your wife.
right, yes, yeah.
It starts to be a violation, and it almost corrupts the relationship that is love. The same is true in both ways. So when I talk about the evidence of love, that is one of them that would be contrary to it. I would say I absolutely love my wife with all of my heart, and I could not possibly love her more than I do today, and yet every day I love her more than I did yesterday. So I can't explain it. It's an impossible.
I can identify with this. Yes.
But it's a fantastic feeling. But I can tell you that if my wife was trying to stab me or otherwise harm me, if there was, aside from mental health issues, if our relationship became about her controlling me or being in one way or another, that would harm the amount of love that I have. That's an evidence-based situation. I think that there are plenty of situations where there's abusive relationships, emotionally or physically, where the abuser can claim very, very strongly to have love for the abused, but their actions speak to the contrary.
Yeah, although I personally wouldn't say that would affect love. I think it would just merely call into account boundaries. There are people who dislike me intensely, and I certainly wouldn't let them into my house if they're, threatening and things like this. But this doesn't change the fact that I would value them as persons. I just don't value their behavior and their liberties that they take. And, I have to draw some lines. But I'm sure that is more to what you would also say. It would break your heart if the relationship were to fall apart into something abusive. In that sense.
That's very true. And I can say that in that situation, I'm not necessarily discussing how that affects my love for my wife, but how that brings evidence to her love for me. I'm talking about, I cannot prove to my wife that I love her, but I know that I do, and therefore I don't need that proof. But for me to have any sort of evidence that my wife loves me, I have to base that on her actions towards me to some extent. If she completely ignored my existence, it would be pretty difficult for me to believe that she loved me.
It would be difficult.
And in all of my experiences and all of the verifiable experiences in human history, according to science, that's been the exact situation for any gods. There have been situations, as you yourself have said you had, was personal experiences with God, and those are the argument from personal experience can be extremely convincing to you, but as you recognized, it doesn't hold any water to anybody who didn't have that experience themselves. So,
and I think that as a theist, I fully own that, and I have to. I feel, in all honesty, recognize that. That is so uncompelling that it really isn't of any value to anyone but me.
My dad used that argument to me all the time, and the hardest part is that he can't even tell me what the experience was. He doesn't remember it. Just tells me that he had an experience once and that he knows that there is a God. And I absolutely appreciate that in him, and I don't. I don't try to discount that, but it needs to be understood that is not something that can compel me. So I know that you said that I can't dig out the quote at the moment. I think it's on a different page, but that you don't feel that your faith can be enough to require other people to believe it, but you still think that it's accurate, right? You're making a claim about reality when you say that you believe that there is a God.
I believe is reasonable. Now, if we were going to be technical, I would technically consider myself an agnostic theist, in that I definitely believe. I've definitely committed myself to the risk of believing. I definitely have a spiritual experience that makes sense to me coherently as a genuine experience of the presence of God. But I, as a person who studied psychology and things like that, I fully recognize that there's ways of spinning this every 10 ways from Sunday, and I accept the fact that that's where it sits, shapeless, uncompelling, and I'm fine with that risk. That's why I call it faith.
I completely recognize that, and I appreciate that you're honest enough to admit it as such. That's something that's difficult for a lot of theists to do. I agree.
It doesn't
I
change
also
the fact that I
am
have that
agnostic.
experience, and that is exactly how it is experienced by me.
So is your faith based entirely on your personal experience with God? Do you, on an intellectual level, do you have any...
my experience
you?
of everything is what defines my understanding of everything. That's my limitation. I'm a human being. I live in this world with 5 senses, and if there's other things that I sense, I haven't clearly defined it or understood it. But hey, that's the limitations of being human. And so, was it Berkeley who even suggested the possibility that none of us even exist? We're all just sentient beings that live in a test tube being manipulated by some supreme being making us think we're having these experiences. How do you prove or disprove that? You can't. So
I think that was the inspiration for the Matrix.
It could be, yes, yeah. But there's a sense in which my personal experience subjectively is all that I have, and my trust of the objective is something that has been inductively trusted. I really can't prove, other than subjective trust, that even the objective realities of the universe are there. To me, even Einstein said that reality is an illusion, although a very persistent one.
Right.
There's a sense in which we're talking so metaphysically here that it's possible to get lost in some implications that are just wild. But I would want to disown the idea that any human being is capable of ever escaping the ultimate subjectivity of being.
Sure, and I can grant you that, but you're right. It's very metaphysical. We're getting into solipsism and the concept that I can't prove that you even exist, or this conversation is not going on within my own mind. I'm not dreaming right now, and I can tell you, I love dreaming. I fly almost every night in my dreams, and sometimes I'll have conversations with my wife, and the next day I'll be upset with her for not remembering them, and then I'll have to think and say, oh, wait, no, I was flying at the time. That means that wasn't real. So they can, illusions can be very, very convincing, and personal experience, even things that your mind create can be. So you're right. Everything could be could exist within your own mind or within a test tube or anything, but
it is not unreasonable to assign a certain level of probability and certainty. And in fact, I see certainty itself as relying upon a continuum. I would even say that even when it comes to science, that the only real place in science where we can be 100% certain is if the data has been defined correctly and measured correctly. It's totally credible.
And science relies on even more than that. The main objectives of science, or the main tenets, things that must be true for science to work, is one, that the universe exists, that it's not all within my mind. And even that, it's possible for science to still remain consistent as long as it's consistent within my mind, which leads to the second point, is that there are rules to this universe that must be followed, that they don't change, they don't break. The laws of the universe are consistent. When I drop an apple today, it goes down. If I drop an apple today, it will go down.
However,
tomorrow
even physicists agree that, say during the Big Bang, that those first 20 seconds of the Big Bang, that it was actually impossible for certain physical processes to occur under that level of compression and energy. And that's one of the reasons why they even claim that all the other elements beyond hydrogen, helium, and lithium, and one other had to come about through supernovas, because the Big Bang couldn't accommodate it, demonstrating that the constraints are different, not because physics actually changed, but because the circumstances under which they are being understood and measured weren't always stable from the Big Bang.
That's true, but even that assumption is still based on the idea that the laws of physics are consistent. And in that point, it would have been impossible, based on the consistency of these laws, for these things to happen.
Exactly, yes.
If things are inconsistent, then it could have been entirely possible. There could have been entirely... And, another assumption that science makes is that they're consistent at least around these parts. There could be an entirely different section of our infinite universe that has slightly different laws of physics, or, we could have a multiverse. But that's, again, getting very metaphysical. It comes down to that if the universe does exist, and that's an assumption that I think is fair to make. As you said, we can't be sure, but we can be pretty confident that that's true. And I agree that things need to be on a spectrum of confidence, and that's one that's about as close to 100% as it can be. And then we can assume that the laws of the universe are consistent, at least in our limited realm. From there, we have to be able to assume that we can observe these laws, that we can make sense of them. And from there, science builds on itself, and it's the process of eliminating assumptions.
We have no reason to believe that the laws of physics are other than what they are, and we have no reason to believe that they're subject to whimsical changes. But you
yourself said that you believe that Jesus Christ was resurrected after his death.
Right.
That would be, by definition, a twisting of the laws of physics. I mean,
how so?
At least the laws of biology, which is all related to physics, that when something is dead, it's dead.
It is, but we don't know why. And we don't know why things that live, and we don't know why things that die. There seems to be a cessation of process, but it's still, in many ways, still to biologists, quite a mystery, And
you're right. I mean, we can restart hearts. My grandfather had, I think it was 8 heart attacks, and nice. he survived through several of them. Well, all of them. He died in a car crash. We can do things to bring people back from the dead, but not 3 days later. People also can't.
Well, not in any way that we're familiar with. No. And maybe that's one of those things we have yet to demonstrate are true, even though we don't know it yet with certainty.
Isn't the definition of a miracle, though, something that happens outside of the workings of nature? That if it can happen naturally and is likely or probable to happen naturally, it's not a miracle.
That's the traditional definition of miracle, and as a person who, like you, accepts the laws of physics, I think that is an assumption that it makes no sense. I think that the miraculous things that we see in Scripture are the way of discussing things that are operating on principles we're just totally unfamiliar with. But I don't think that they are a violation of the universe in any manner at all, personally.
So how would you define a miracle then?
It is, to me, a linguistic construct. It is a way of trying to put it into some sort of coherent comprehension. And that's from our standpoint. It's a point of view. From God, who I would see as having free will, if he decides to create a big bang and create an entire universe, he does so out of free will. I can't do a thing like that. My standpoint is very limited to who I am as a human being. So I see the miracle, the word miracle, the concept of miracle as being a human point of view. From the divine point of view, it's more like, yeah, maybe okay, you know. And,
well, sure, it's a whim in that case. If you have unlimited power to do whatever you'd like, then a miracle is just a run-of-the-mill action.
There's also wisdom. Think about it. There's things you could do for your son that you shouldn't, even though you can. You could spoil him terribly. But if he's going to grow up into this world and become a very truly responsible young man, he's going to have to learn some limits and some respect, and there's going to be some moments that'll be perhaps a little difficult. But wisdom would require you to not just totally indulge him. I suppose that the human condition is such that we are people, I would think, it would be extremely unwise to indulge us in all of the possibilities.
I agree, but at the same time, with unlimited power, if there is a God that does have unlimited power, I can tell you, to bring in a personal anecdote, my son, I think it was about a month ago, we were at our family's cottage and cooking dinner, and as we had pulled a pot of noodles off of the burner, it had sat there for probably 3 or 4 minutes, and my son reached up and touched the side of the pot. And
Nice.
Although we'd used the term hot for him dozens of times, and then some, and he understood he can use the term hot himself, and he knows it means don't touch, he had no idea what the term hot really meant until he touched that pot. At that point, he had a learning experience, and it was
which brings us back to the subjective limits we have as humans. Yes.
Yeah, and it was fortunate for us that he didn't receive any blisters or any sort of lasting damage from it, just hot enough to make him very uncomfortable for a moment. But that was still a necessary evil for him to learn that. And he had to go through that painful experience to understand it. However, if I was capable of it, I would have loved to simply imbue that knowledge onto him without him needing to go through that experience.
Well, I can understand you're feeling that way, but I would caution you this. If you did that, if you had that ability, something worse than touching something hot and not actually getting a blister would be the only thing that could then teach him that, perhaps. If you could cause that to be avoided, or if you could cause him to know that, you'd have to somehow violate his coherence as a person, and he would have to live in a reality that is beyond his own subjective experience in being able to take responsibility for it. So, I don't think it works.
It does boil back down, though, to the question of sort of the solipsist or the matrix idea that we had talked about before. Is I love to use the analogy of the matrix in the idea of being an all-powerful God, because are you familiar with the movie, by the way?
I loved it, yeah, and I should add, I don't believe in an all-powerful God, only because I think that the term itself is nonsense. I don't think that people really understand or appreciate infinity. I mean, infinity doesn't work the way most people think it does. All doesn't work the way most people think. For example, theoretically, just for argument's sake, let's say I have a barrel of cats, and in this barrel is an infinite number of cats, and each one has a unique name. And then over here I got another barrel, and in that barrel is an infinite number of dogs, and each one of them has an infinite name. Let's assume that God knows the name of every cat and doesn't know the name of a single dog. And this would be a situation where God's knowledge is both infinite as is his ignorance. and there's nothing wrong with the concept of infinity in defining it the way we do in using that analogy. So this concept of an all-powerful God, in my opinion, is philosophical nonsense. How powerful is God? I have no clue. I don't think anybody does. I don't think the concept even makes sense. Whatever power there is essential. I suppose that's all taken care of. But to me, I think we get involved into the mathematical nonsense of divide by zero. It doesn't work.
But I mean, it's the whole concept. I completely do understand, and I agree that an all-powerful God is a logically impossible thing. But that's assuming that logic is consistent. And if there is this all-powerful God, we can assume that God created logic and has moved, or has the ability to move past it and to do things that are completely illogical. I mean, you're right. The concept is difficult.
From a human standpoint, it is unworkable. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily actually unworkable. But in terms of us as human beings, the concept of infinity is largely misunderstood and applied to God in ways that end up being, at least from our standpoint, nonsense. Whether or not there is any way of applying it, who knows?
Even if we can disregard the infinite power argument, we can still say the idea of God, and I think that you would agree with this one as a theist. The God that you believe is a very largely powerful being, something with the ability to create a universe in one way, shape, or form. Is that correct?
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. Now, that God, I would assume, might have the ability to manipulate the subjective experiences of humans. You talk about being limited by your subjective experience, but your subjective experience can be changed with things like drugs or even different hypnosis or therapies can change your memories. It's been very, very well established that memories are very inconsistent and not very reliable at all on a human scale. So,
absolutely, yes.
Subjective experience is it's not only subjective, it's also flawed, extremely, very, very liquid or very fluid, I should say. So we can assume that a God with the power to create the universe would have the ability to create memories that never happened, a la Total Recall. Sorry, I love movies. I'm going to use a lot of these references through the show. So if you haven't seen these movies, it should be your homework assignments, viewers.
Right.
Go out and watch them.
Why? But why? What would be the need of that? And unless he was going to actually create beings who are also totally possessing of the same capabilities. To me, I guess this is a fantasy. Why, we may dream of the ability to do that, but I don't think we appreciate what all the implications of it are.
Well, sure, and you're right. I mean, there's plenty of implications of what a deity with this sort of power could do, and what it all comes back around to is talking about the science and assumptions and things that we can do. Is it's not a reasonable assumption in my mind to say that any God like that does exist, and that comes from the simple idea that that's a huge assumption. The concept of parsimony or Occam's razor is that we should accept the simplest explanations that we can and avoid making.
That's not a scientific principle. That's a philosophy.
That's true.
And I think it's a good one.
But that's the philosophy that the science is based on.
Occam's razor?
It's one of them. In science, it's called parsimony, but it's very, very strongly associated with science.
I think it's a very useful principle, but I don't think it's a proven principle, and I don't think it needs to be. I still find it useful. But I think that, as we were talking before, with the subjectiveness of it all, evidently, reality is something that's a bit beyond our grasp. And I think I'm comfortable with that. And I don't believe that science represents a way of necessarily grasping it all, but rather grasping a great deal of it. And very well.
I can give you that. And I love that you brought up usefulness. That's what I was really digging at this whole time, is that when we talk about the assumptions that we make with regards to science, There are some that are necessary, and they're necessary because they're useful. The assumption that the universe exists is an assumption that we have to make. Otherwise, there's really no point to even continue discussing things. The assumption that you exist is an important one for me to have a conversation with you. Otherwise, I can assume I'm talking with myself, and I have no need to go further. So there's certain degrees of reasonable assumptions. And the reason that we can make these assumptions is because we have to. They're utilitarian. And I struggle with that idea with God, with why is the... I got at that a little bit last week with what I, as an atheist, am losing, what I'm missing out on by not having a belief in God. And you told me you need to get to know me better, and it's quite a bit. And I think you even said that I might not have a need for God. And if that's the case, then what is the usefulness
I don't think I
of the
said
God
you don't
hypothesis?
have a need for God, but you're not aware of a need for God. And I don't know that you need to have an awareness of that. Of course, being a universal reconciliationist, I would be a person who would believe that to whatever degree that may represent a real need is something that in time you will come to see in a way you can accept, and it will not be forced on you. And so, so I'm not going to deny that there is a need, but I certainly don't feel that I, as a person, have any obligation to know what that need is. Or how that specifically applies to you or anybody. I'm not even sure I know how it applies to me.
I guess that's a fair statement there, but
but let me take this a little bit farther in terms of this parsimony and this Occam's razor thing. Einstein was blacklisted when he first started talking about special relativity and general relativity, and when he talked to people about it, they thought he was a kook. What need did they have of these ideas, these theories? Physics was working well, and he actually couldn't get a job as a professor that he wanted until such time as physics itself started running into a brick wall, and then they began to reconsider. And the next thing you know, now we're even beyond Einstein in terms of those things. But if you've studied biology, you probably had to also study research methods, which would have included a whole body of academic literature on confirmatory bias, research bias, design bias, selection and sampling bias, procedural bias, measurement bias, interview bias, response bias, cultural bias, gender bias. We have discovered, and we know that our scientific process is not immune to bias. Now, I think it is an excellent process, and I think that in theory we are really, many scientists, genuinely seeking to uphold the principles of it with absolute nobility. But if we're going to be honest, we have discovered varieties of ways that we are failing to properly measure the weight of smoke.
But as a scientist, or the process of science, and I wanted to note that we are running about 5 minutes left, and I'm really excited that it's been a great conversation, but I just want to let you know we are going to need to wrap up here shortly. But what I was going to say is science, you're right. That was an impressive list, by the way, of biases to be able to rattle that off. Did you have that written down?
It's right there in front of my camera.
Okay, wow.
See, I had to study research methods in sociology and in statistics and things like that. So that was just something I wrote down before the show.
Oh, I was thinking you recalled that from memory for a second. And that was impressive. But, I absolutely agree. And bias is one of the things that is the most convincing part of atheism, is that when I talk to people of faith, the strongest concept that comes is it's confirmation bias, it's cultural bias. There's dozens of different ways. I mean, I've had people tell me that prayers are answered, and they're answered with yes, no, or wait, or not yet.
I'm not in that camp. I really
ask me any question, I can tell you yes, no, or wait. I could pray the same thing to a toaster and have roughly the same. It doesn't change anything. So when we talk about biases, that is an awesome point, and that's what science is about. You're right. There are all
And
kinds of
by
huge research biases and
I
things that
commend
humans
the
are subject
scientific
to.
community for having that. I commend them for having the honesty to deal with science and recognizing how these problems come in. And I also am a little bit peeved with the spiritual community for failing to do something very similar, to recognize the sort of bias we as people with a spiritual experience bring to the theology and the explanations that we have. And indeed, I really perceive that a great deal of the religious nonsense is a result of this failure to step up to the plate of honesty and integrity. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest, you mentioned last week, one of the biggest ways to create an atheist is have them read the Bible. Well, also maybe read a theology book, you know.
Oh, my favorite, by the way, is the ontological argument, which even theists have rejected, but that is my favorite theological argument.
Well, I'll tell you, as a theist, I reject all of the arguments for the existence of God, every single one of them. I reject all of them as having any validity.
How is it possible then to maintain a belief in God and not to have any sort of logical, cogent, I can't say that word today, argument for why to have that? I mean, you said last week that it doesn't require any justification, but how is it possible to hold a positive belief in something? That's where I stand as an atheist too. I reject all of those, and that's why I'm an atheist. It's
no, you don't. No, you don't.
In
fact, we just spent some time talking about how awesome a relationship you do have with your wife, and that you're not relying on your scientific confirmability for that. This is, and you're not being totally unreasonable. In fact, you brought in the idea that the behavior that's going on it has plays a big role in your ability to commit to the idea that you are loved. And I also would agree that some of the nonsense that religious people have concerning what they believe God is or is not doing is unfortunately some crazy stuff that they're just off there in la la land somewhere. And I think that when people take a look and see what it is, particularly when it's obvious that that isn't working, it isn't happening that way, then it creates some serious problems. But
Bob, I completely agree, and I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off. We're down to about a minute and a half here, and I wanted to wrap it up with a comment that I think next week would be a fantastic opportunity. I'm looking at getting some other guests. I've not been able to line that up yet, so I'm hoping you can join me again next week. And at that point, I have a book that I'd love to start moving forward in. It's called 50 Reasons People Give for Believing in a God. And it's a very, very short, easy read book, goes point by point, real reasons, not theological arguments, but reasons that people give for saying why they personally believe in a God. And I'd love to know not just why you believe in a God, because it sounds like I'd love to get to your story as to your personal experience, but to talk with you and to invite the audience to interact with us on why they believe in God. And if we could discuss some of these reasons and these justifications, because this is about honesty. And as you said, you can't hold that intellectual honesty and hold any of those arguments together. So if any of our viewers are out there, ask yourself, why do you believe in God? And write it in. Send us a message. Send it on Facebook. Send it through email, text message. We would love to hear it. We would love to discuss it. We would love to have you interact. But now it is closing time. So thank you very much for joining us. Come back next week and enjoy another conversation with myself and Bob Greaves to inspire some more honesty in you. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.